Creating a Podcast. Join 3 international students from Romania, Sierra Leone, and Rwanda as 3 journalists work together on the ins and outs of podcast creation.
It sounds like your idea is formed. Hooray!
You know, people were talking about their ideas and everything and like giving some tips and tricks, and I just thought of this idea, and then I went to bed and I dreamed of like the whole thing and how I wanted to look, and then I wanted to go on here, but I didn't know exactly if it's, you know, possible.
So I think you know, if you've got 3 or 4 questions up your sleeve, you don't have to ask them all, because if your questions are really good, they'll just be open-ended and the person will just talk. That's probably enough. If your clock is running over 20 minutes, you want to kind of wrap it up, because editing takes time. You know, you don't want an hour and a half of interview times 3 to go through. That's a lot of work. So I think but equally, we've talked a lot about not being frightened of the silence and allowing people to say what they want to say. So, you know, gauge it. Some people don't have that much to say, some people have a lot. But I think at about 20 minutes, you want to be thinking, okay, are we still getting value out of this interview? Or are we just, you know, collecting words for no reason? So try and feel it. And if you're getting vox pops like Joanna might be in Cluj, you know, asking people what makes them human, you know, that might be a 40-second grab, you know, and then you move on to the next person. So it depends what kind of thing you're trying to get.
There's the macro level and then there's the micro level. You can look at a story from a really broad perspective. For example, let's just look at climate change issues, for example. You want to look at what's going on in your community, who's doing what, and create kind of a human aspect to it. For example, in my undergrad, our theme for our video journalism class was climate change, and we had to create documentaries on climate change issues. So what we did was we just went on Google, we searched people, we talked to people around the communities and things like that. And eventually we found somebody who was doing sustainable farming, and he was doing something in his community that no one else was doing. And so that inspires people to do more in their communities. So just focusing on maybe the human aspect of somebody to start off with, instead of just going for a big topic, because sometimes that can be very daunting.
What are the crucial elements to our story? That these are some things that we need to know even before entering into the whole production process. So one of the first steps could be in knowing your audience. And again, now that we have some kind of a idea of what each of us are going to do with our podcast, so we can think of the characters, the places, the people that we are going to focus, or are we going to focus on the process? Like Nicole just mentioned to Kamutske about the story of the addiction, right? But are you actually planning to focus on any 1 or 2 particular individual, their story or their journey in this whole big topic of addiction? Is that something that you want to focus on? That will also help us to refine the idea a little bit more. And then comes the hook or the suspense, you know, which I feel is a very important element of any story or any podcasting. And the next comes the clear storyline, or the scene by scene structure that we will be discussing in detail later. The ability to put that elements in a simpler format helps us to keep our audience and our listeners for a longer time, so that the listeners don't get confused, because you know, so it is important for us to also focus on the structure, on what we are going to say and how we are going to narrate the whole podcast. And the last is the appeal or the call to action. Do we have a very specific call to action that we want our listeners to follow after listening to our podcast? Or do we just want to leave our listeners with some kind of a thought that they will further work on? Or is it educative, or it is more informative, or it is just an emotional connect that you want to build with your audience?
My parents moved from Egypt to Canada in the 80s, and I grew up in Canada. And so there's this idea of a conflicting culture, the Eastern and the Western culture kind of colliding, and how difficult that was for me growing up. So I was the main character in that situation, and I interviewed one of my best friends growing up, so she knew my story, and she was also Moroccan Canadian, so she could tell a little bit of her story. And I would also interview my psychologist, essentially. She was kind of the expert opinion, and she was a secondary character as well. So you can create yourself as the main character, and tell your story as well. That's absolutely fine. I kind of broke down my scenes into 6 different blocks. So I started out with the introduction to the topic, and then I moved on to an extensive look into identity crisis driven by anecdotal content. So what I did was I utilized specific stories or a story, and I was going to throw that into the scene and talk a bit about a specific issue, such as like gender issues, the difference between men and women as second generation immigrants, for example. And then I talked about my backstory a little bit. And then the connection between trauma and mental health. So then I started looking into more of the research aspect, the more expert aspect, and that's where my experts shine through in this scene. And then finally, I looked into the solutions, like what can we do to kind of cope with the trauma, to cope with the mental health issues of being a second generation immigrant? How do we look into identity crisis, that sort of thing? And then finally, the conclusion, just my final thoughts. So this is kind of a great way to put your story into perspective, and so it doesn't jumble up when you're talking. And so it kind of like breaks down the scenes, and then you can kind of transition between one right after the other.
So where I'm reading, welcome to today's edition of my podcast, and I'm your host. That to me is very radio, and we want it to be very podcast. So my suggestion is going to be, and I think you know where I'm going with this, is, hi, I'm Kumuske Kumar. I'm from Sierra Leone. I'm 20 and I want to talk about blah, 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 blah. Yeah. So really dialing it down. Remember, the people who listen to podcasts, you're in their ears. You're literally in their head. You're probably not on the car radio. You're probably not in the living room. You're actually in someone's head. And so the tone and the way that you talk to that person needs to be very kind of relaxed, conversational. You're not shouting into their ears. Okay. So there's a really big difference in how you project your voice. So I know you've worked in radio before, and I can see where that's coming from. So this was a young man who is very keen on hunting, so shooting animals and eating them. And I was at first like, oh, that's an interesting topic for a podcast. And he does it in he makes the podcast in quite a dramatic way. So he uses ambient sound to tell a story. And one of the good things about a podcast is they can make people think differently. And certainly by the end of this, I thought very differently about the topic of hunting, in the sense that, those of us who eat meat, we happily go to the supermarket and buy a dead animal. We don't really ask about how it was killed. Whereas he's living and allowing an animal to be free and shooting it and then eating it. So what is the difference? It was a good.
It was more example. Of when we go down to the woods, the pigeons would be doing damage on the crops, and the way of us controlling the pigeons would be to roost them as they go into the woods, because they'll come in less numbers and you'll be doing a better job. And I remember I was standing just next to this poplar tree. We went down there on purpose to shoot pigeons. And I was trying a few shots at them, but then this one just comes straight over in a straight line towards me. I just remember bringing up my gun and just pulling through it. I think it was more of a natural aspect. It was a nice shot, really. I can remember it to this day. But yeah, I was with my dad and my granddad at the time, and it was quite a good thing, because from that, when I shot it, we went home straight away and we pressed it off. And one of our ways of doing it was pigeon on toast with onion. That was the first time I ever shot, butchered, and ate something for myself. I think people should be willing to try game meat, because it's organic, it's healthy, it's tasty. There's no medicines in it. It's a perfectly healthy meat. It's much higher in protein, lower in fat, depending on what bird or animal you eat. But I think people should be willing to try it, because it's very sustainable too. It's not farmed. It's there, and it can be cheap if people started to buy it. I try and eat game as much as I can, but really we do buy some meat from the supermarket. There's nothing wrong with that. We'll buy beef, we'll buy lamb, really. They're our top two meats. We try not to buy stuff like chicken too much because we've got pheasant, we've got pigeon, we've got quite a lot of white meats like partridge and rabbit. We can make meals that you make for the chicken with those animals.
What they've done, what that young man has done, is he's interviewed people who fulfill his question, you know, young hunters in the UK, but he's also added in sound effects. So that sort of it takes you there, and he's added in, you know, shots and everything else. He didn't interview that person while they were shooting pigeons. So it just gives an example of a controversial topic that this young man felt strongly about and wanted to tell the story from different angles. So and the audience was very broad and may well have changed their mind as a result of listening to first person testimony, first person experiences. So I wanted to finish with that.